this working? Yes, it is. Hi, I'm Sharon Warner. I'm an English professor at UNM, and I'm here tonight to make just a few remarks about the D.H. Lawrence Ranch Initiatives, which is described on the back of your program. It's an organization within the university that is dedicated to raising the stature of the D.H. Lawrence Ranch and serving as an advocate for the ranch, both to the university administration, to other departments, and to the community at large. And so we're doing various things to try to let people know about the ranch, which when people do know about it, they're very interested in it. And we also want to advocate for it to be used as in various different ways, as an educational destination, and it is already a real tourist attraction. It draws well over 1,000 people a year, even though it's only open on a few days. We have with us this evening for our second annual lecturer, a wonderful scholar who's come here from Nottingham, England, and he'll be introduced in just a moment. But I'm going to introduce a couple of other folks, or mention a couple of other folks. The first person I would like to recognize is Dr. Hugh Whittemire, and he's going to be making an introduction in a minute. Hugh Whittemire, would you please stand up? When I came to the University of New Mexico as an assistant professor teaching creative writing, fiction writing, Hugh was the first person I talked to about the D.H. Lawrence Ranch. And he was the person I worked with for several years because we both have a real interest and passion for the ranch. And it's wonderful that he's here tonight participating in this lecture. And I certainly would not be standing on this stage if it were not for him, because he always encouraged me to continue working on behalf of the ranch. So thank you very much, Hugh. The other person I would like to, there's two other people to acknowledge. Our English department chair, Anita Obermeyer, is here. Anita, where are you? And Anita's also been very encouraging where the ranch is concerned, as has the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Mark Pisani, who's not here tonight. But the other person that I work with on behalf of the ranch is the Dean of Fine Arts, Kimberly Pender. And she is here tonight, and she's going to make an introduction for Hugh Whittemire. So I'd like to welcome Kimberly Pender to this stage. She's a wonderful dean, and she's been working really hard on behalf of the College of Fine Arts, and there's so many wonderful things happening there. So I'll let her take the stage.
Thank you for that introduction. And can you hear me? I'm really pleased and honored to be asked to be at least introducing this program because this has been a part of a partnership between the Arts and Sciences and the College of Fine Arts because of the great importance of Taos and D.H. Lawrence in not only literature here in New Mexico, but of course the Taos modernists, and so many of them that were drawn to that area. And of course the Harwood Museum of Art up there has an amazing collection that is part of that history. And the Harwood Museum is a part of the University of New Mexico as well. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Whittemire, and then he's going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Whittemire is a retired professor of English and American literature of the University of New Mexico. Although not a Lawrence scholar, he has taught Lawrence's work in both graduate and undergraduate courses. His slide lecture on D.H. Lawrence in New Mexico has been presented to audiences in the United States, Europe, and Australia. And his stage reading about Lawrence's time in New Mexico was presented at UNM and the International D.H. Lawrence Conference in Sydney. He has served on the boards of the D.H. Lawrence Society of North America and the Friends of D.H. Lawrence, a Taos community organization. Between 1998 and 2003, Dr. Whittemire participated in the creation of the Lawrence Society's successful application to list the ranch on the National Registry of Historic Places, which is an amazing accomplishment. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Pinder. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Andrew Harrison to New Mexico. Dr. Harrison is a professor of English literature at the University of Nottingham and director of the D.H. Lawrence Research Center there. He is a well-known authority on Lawrence's life and work and a central figure in the international community of scholars and students who share that interest. Dr. Harrison is the author of 2 books on Lawrence, one a biography published in 2016, and the other a 2003 study of the impact Italian Futurism had on Lawrence and his work. He has also published many essays about Lawrence and his contemporaries, including Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, and George Gisli. He is the founding editor of the Journal of D.H. Lawrence Studies, and the editor of 2 volumes of essays on Lawrence by other scholars, one published by the Oxford University Press, and the other forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Dr. Harrison is also a central figure in the international community of Lawrence's admirers. He is president of the D.H. Lawrence Society of Great Britain and a member of its North American counterpart. He is at the nexus of international Lawrence symposia and conferences, presenting papers and helping to organize programs in Britain, France, Italy, Australia, and here in New Mexico, where he is scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the 2020 Lawrence Conference in Taos. As a teacher, Dr. Harrison offers undergraduate and postgraduate courses at all levels and supervises PhD theses. In 2013, he received the Lord Deering Award for Excellence in Teaching. Let me return for a moment to the D.H. Lawrence Research Center at the University of Nottingham, of which Dr. Harrison is director. The Research Center collaborates with the University Library on behalf of, to build an archive of manuscripts, correspondence, photographs, first editions, and other primary materials on the life and work of Lawrence, and to facilitate access to the collection by students, scholars, and visitors. The center also has a mandate to promote the, quote, understanding of Lawrence's life and legacy within and outside academia. Outside academia. Now, this commitment to outreach means that, among other things, Dr. Harrison frequently works with the D.H. Lawrence Heritage, a community organization in the nearby town of Eastwood, where Lawrence was born and raised in the family of a coal miner. The Heritage maintains a museum containing Lawrence family memorabilia, promotes a walking tour of Eastwood, Eastwood locations related to Lawrence's early years, and organizes exhibits highlighting various aspects of the milieu that helped shape Lawrence and his work. I knew that he had worked with this group in Eastwood. I didn't know until tonight that he now lives in Eastwood, which was Lawrence's hometown. This evening, Dr. Harrison will talk to us about a much-debated short story that Lawrence wrote during his New Mexico sojourn in the early 1920s. At this time, he lived on a mountainside ranch near Taos that had once belonged to Mabel Dodge Lujan. 3 decades later, Lawrence's widow, Frida, transferred ownership of the property to the University of New Mexico. The story in question is entitled, The Woman Who Rode Away. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Harrison.
Well, I'd like to thank Hugh for that that very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for inviting me to give this D.H. Lawrence lecture today. It's a very great honour for me to be here in New Mexico, the place, of course, that Lawrence loved so much. The place about which he said it was the place that gave him the greatest experience from the outside world that he ever had. It was the place, of course, that Lawrence wished to return to at the end of his life. But couldn't because of his failing health. Thank you. I have to say some thank yous before I begin. I'd like to thank Ava Lipton-Ormand and Julianne Newmark for their kindness in inviting me to come here today to talk, and for their incredible efficiency in organising my visit. It's not easy when you invite somebody from outside America, from Europe, to come and visit. There are all kinds of complications in terms of getting the right visa requirements, etc. And they both did an incredible job in that respect. Of course, I'd like to thank the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of New Mexico and the D.H. Lawrence Ranch Initiatives for initiating this series of lectures, and of course for the very vital task of preserving the ranch and commemorating its importance for Lawrence. It really is an honour to be here today and to meet so many people who are so passionate about Lawrence and passionate about the arts more generally in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, in Taos, in Santa Fe. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm looking so much forward to the remainder of my visit here. I think I should say at the outset that probably today, when I was thinking about what to talk about, of course I wanted to say something about Lawrence's time in New Mexico, particularly his time living at the Kiowa Ranch, and hence the choice of my topic. But I suppose that my approach is really shaped in some ways by two book projects that I've been involved with recently. One of them, actually, I'm in the middle of copy editing at the minute, a new collection of 33 essays on Lawrence by international scholars, a lot of them North American, actually. It's a volume of essays that's going to be called D.H. Lawrence in Context. And the essays are organised around, firstly, thinking through how Lawrence's life is revealed through his letters, through his writings, and through the many biographies that have been written about him since his death in 1930. But also thinking through the different social, historical, and literary contexts and artistic contexts to his life and his work. And also, importantly, about the reception of Lawrence's work, his popular and his academic reputations. And something of my reflections on that have come through the work that I've done on that volume, you'll hear about in the course of this paper. Also, of course, in 2016, as Hugh said, I wrote a biography of Lawrence. This is a very anxiety-laden activity, because so many people have done it before, and one can never rise to the standards of some of the biographers who have worked on D.H. Lawrence. There's a very great list of scholars who have done that work, both in North America and in Europe as well. But I suppose what I wanted to do is to reflect something of my broader interest in the way that a life is felt in the work, in the writings of an author. Not always in the very straightforward ways, in the way that a piece of work might draw on people whom an author knew or places, but sometimes in the broader atmosphere of the writing. And I suppose part of my paper is going to reflect on the way that New Mexico found its way into Lawrence's creative writing in the period that he was here and living in the Kiowa Ranch. So, in a letter of the 22nd of January 1925 to the Italian literary critic Carlo Linati, D.H. Lawrence famously expressed his commitment to art as a means of challenging people's beliefs and values. He wrote, "I can't bear art that you can walk round and admire. A book should be either a bandit or a rebel or a man in the crowd. I hate the actor and audience business. An author should be in among the crowd, kicking their shins or cheering them on to some mischief or merriment. Lawrence was, in his life, increasingly opposed to what he liked to call, quite wonderfully I think, literary culture, with an air in the middle. A sedate and a polite culture fueled by courtesy and by mutual appreciation. From the very beginning of his career, Lawrence was as suspicious of excessive praise as he was of unthinking criticism. He gave and he accepted no quarter, and he saw disagreement, upset and conflict as means to change and to growth. He never shied away from it. And I think Lawrence actually is a writer who makes very high demands on his readers. He asks us always to engage honestly and openly with texts which perhaps challenge our most dearly held views. I think his ideal reader, in many respects, is that very rare thing, someone who's willing to be transformed by the exposure in print to new ideas and to new experiences, rather than having their own pre-existing ideas reinforced. But the long and complex history of the reception of Lawrence's writing contains many examples of readers who, understandably, I think, refused to engage with him in this way. These were readers who responded to Lawrence's reputation, perhaps, rather than to the texts that were in front of them. And I want to start, really, with a few extreme and rather comical examples which will help me, perhaps, to underline this point. The first two examples focus on Anglo-American authors, and I've tried to concentrate all the way through on Anglo-American writers because it seemed very topical for me as I was thinking about this paper. In March to April 1914, Henry James published in the Times Literary Supplement a two-part article on recent and upcoming British novelists. The second part of that article was entitled The Younger Generation, and James identified D.H. Lawrence, Gilbert Cannon, Hugh Walpole, and Compton Mackenzie as the most promising young British writers. I think you'll probably agree that of those four writers, Lawrence has stood the test of time, perhaps better for an international audience. But at the time, James said that Lawrence hung in the dusty rear of the four. I must say that that article was very high profile in Britain and created a lot of jealousy among people who weren't among the four, who weren't chosen by James. When this article was republished the same year in James's collection of essays, Notes on Novelists, one of James's friends, who'd been particularly impressed by Lawrence's breakthrough novel, Sons and Lovers, published the year before in 1913, reproached James for dealing so summarily with D.H. Lawrence. In her autobiography, A Backward Glance, Edith Wharton reported how James responded to this friend's comment. "Come now," said the friend, "have you ever read any of Lawrence's novels? Really read them?" James's, we're told, most mischievous smile crept down from his eyes to his lips. I've trifled with the exordia," he murmured with a wicked twinkle. The number of times when I think my students could have responded to one of the questions I asked by saying that they perhaps trifled with the exordia during writing essays. But I think that's a wonderful and very typically Jamesian response to being pushed into a corner. A second example, in 1927, towards the end of Lawrence's writing career, in his essay Paleface, the Canadian-born writer, cultural critic and artist Wyndham Lewis, taking issue with what he saw as Lawrence's idealization of Native American ceremonies in Mornings in Mexico, referred to Lawrence's credo as a hot and piping trinity of rough stuff primitivism and Freudian hot sex stuff. And Lewis went on, With Sons and Lovers, his first book, he was at once hot foot upon the fashionable trail of incest. The book is an eloquent, wallowing mass of mother love and sex idolatry. His Women in Love is again the same thick, sentimental, luscious stew. I think you can really sense how much Lewis enjoys sending Lawrence up as an author obsessed by the primitive and by an unhealthy sensuality and eroticism. His views, of course, are expressed with a suave knowingness which takes our assent for granted. Of course, we all know what D.H. Lawrence is like. Freudian, sex-obsessed, neurotic. Except, of course, that he gets the details all wrong. Sons and Lovers was not Lawrence's first book, as Lewis so confidently states. It was his third novel, and actually his fourth book. He'd published two novels, The White Peacock and The Trespasser, before it, and the poetry collection Love Poems and Others, before Sons and Lovers appeared in May 1913. And I privately wonder how much of Lawrence Lewis had read by 1927, outside of course, Mornings in Mexico. In his private library, which is now at the Harry Ransom Center of Austin, Texas, there are an awful lot of the books that he wrote about, all neatly annotated, but there's no copy of Sons and Lovers, there's no copy of The Rainbow, and there's no copy of Women in Love. My last example is another comic one that comes from very shortly before Lawrence's death. A man named Stephen Potter wrote a monograph of Lawrence entitled D.H. Lawrence, A First Study. And this actually was the first critical study of Lawrence's writing to be published in Britain. It appeared in March 1930, very shortly after Lawrence's death, actually the month of his death. I should say America got in much earlier. The first critical monograph to ever be published on Lawrence appeared in 1924, so midway through Lawrence's career. This was by an American named Herbert Seligman and was entitled D.H. Lawrence, An American Appreciation. Returning to Potter's book in 1930, he actually contacted Lawrence shortly before his death to ask whether he had a photograph which he could give Potter to put in the book. And Lawrence very kindly referred him on to one of his sisters, who sent a photograph along for that very purpose. In an appendix to Potter's volume, he lists all the books which Lawrence published during his lifetime. Unfortunately, though, under 1921, a book appears which Lawrence did not write. This is a book entitled Sex and Sardinia. Anybody who knows D.H. Lawrence will know that book's actually called Sea and Sardinia. In a humorous inscription in a copy of the book which recently came up for sale, Potter inscribed it to a friend and asked him to, quote, turn to page 158 for world record Freudian misprint. That's the kind of mistake which you dread when you do copy editing. I think each of those examples shows how very difficult it is in the case of a writer like D.H. Lawrence with a strong reputation and a public presence to actually see the writing that's in front of you and to respond to it with that honesty which he demands, rather than simply projecting onto him the things you've heard and the attitudes which you expect to find in his texts. The problem with actually seeing literary texts, of course, and responding to them in that honest fashion is that it leads to a realm of complexity and uncertainty which can be very disconcerting. Much easier to package him up and give the people what they're expecting to see in the first place. But it can also, of course, be wonderfully enriching. And the example I want to discuss with you today is a particularly striking one. The Woman Who Rode Away is one of Lawrence's most disturbing short stories. It addresses in a critical and a confrontational fashion a series of very divisive subjects that are at the heart of modern life, including, of course, issues of power, gender, sexuality, and race. No wonder, then, that the history of its reception is so fraught and conflictual. What I'll do is actually begin by introducing the story for those of you who are not yet familiar with it. And I must say that those of you who aren't familiar with it one of the great joys for me would be, if you went out, rather than buying anything by me on the stall outside, bought a copy of The Woman Who Rode Away and actually read the story. It really is an experience, and that would be success for me, really, in terms of the talk. So first of all, I'll begin by introducing the story. I'll then explain the various ways in which the story has been read, before ending with what I hope will be a fresh biographical approach to it, which may just help to illuminate another corner of its meaning. My overall purpose is to show how this text's literary qualities are inseparable from the challenge which it offers to us as readers. And I also want to suggest that perhaps one mark of its greatness as a story resides in its creative ambiguity, in its accommodation of multiple interpretations. Well, The Woman Who Rode Away was written in June 1924, during Lawrence's first full month living at the Lobo Ranch in Taos, which his New Mexican host, Mabel Dodge Lujan, had gifted to Lawrence's wife Frida by the 4th of April 1924, and which Lawrence went on to rename the Kiowa Ranch. The plot of the story draws on a visit which Lawrence made with Mabel to a Native American ceremonial cave at Arroyo Seco, a village outside Taos, and the trip he had made with the Danish artist Kai Gertcher the year before in the autumn of 1923 down the west coast of Mexico, where quite unbelievably at one point he had the idea of setting up a banana plantation. One of several utopian schemes which Lawrence dreamt up at various points in his life, but about which for a brief time he was actually, I think, quite serious. So the woman in the title of the story, The Woman Who Rode Away, is a 33-year-old Californian from Berkeley who's married to a wealthy Dutch immigrant named Leadmon, 20 years her senior. Leadmon had first moved to the USA as a young boy. He'd worked, we're told, in the gold mines of the West before moving down to Mexico, where he owned and ran silver mines in the wilds of the Sierra Madre, alongside the mountains of Chihuahua. After the Great War, we're told, the trade in silver collapsed, and he was forced to shut the mines down and turn instead to raising purebred hogs. As the story opens, the woman has been married to Leadmon for around 13 years. They have a young daughter and son, and they live in comparative luxury. But the adventure which she sought through their relationship and marriage has well and truly soured. She's now imprisoned in their home beneath the imposing wreck of the silver works, prevented from going out alone by a husband who treats her as a possession and jealously guards her against any male encroachment. Her disillusionment with this very secluded life masks an unquenched longing for adventure. So when one of her husband's business contacts visits the house and foolishly romanticizes what he calls the savage and wild Indian tribes in the surrounding mountains, the woman decides to seek them out. When her husband and his friend depart on a business trip, she saddles up her horse, and on the pretext of visiting her 9-year-old daughter Margarita at the convent school that she's placed her in, rides out in the direction of what her husband has described as the very most savage tribe, the Chilchus. This is a tribe that Lawrence invented, of course. He takes a lot of liberties in that way. After more than a day in the saddle, she's greeted by 3 members of the tribe. She tells them that she wants to visit the Chilchu Indians, to know their houses and to know their gods. She's taken to their remote home, where she tells the chief that she's tired of the white man's god and wishes to serve the gods of the Chilchu. She's later asked very specifically by the chief whether she brings her heart to the god of the Chilchu, and she answers yes. That, of course, seals her fate. She's imprisoned, guarded and drugged with a sweet emetic drink, which heightens her responsiveness to the drumming and the dancing of her captors, but also leaves her tired and will-less. The description here of the drumming, as she understands it and responds to it through this drugged state, is, I think, quite typical of Lawrence at his very best. It's wonderfully evocative. I have to read a little section from this. It went on all day, the insistence of the drum, the cavernous, roaring, storm-like sound of the male singing, the incessant swinging of the fox skins behind the powerful gold-bronze stamping legs of the men, the autumn sun from a perfect blue heaven pouring on the rivers of black hair, men's and women's, the valley all still, the walls of rock beyond, the awful huge bulking of the mountain against the pure sky, its snow seething with sheer whiteness. Through one of the younger Indians, the grandson of the chief, the woman learns about the sun god that people worship, and she comes to understand their hatred of the white man who stole the sun and the white woman who stole the moon. She senses gradually that she figures in their plans to win back the sun and the moon. Finally, on the winter solstice, she's carried to a cave and laid out on a stone, pinned down by her arms and legs. The story ends as dramatically as anything Lawrence ever wrote, as the sun is about to set and the obsidian knife held by the elderly chief hovers over her heart. It is, as I said at the outset, a very disturbing tale. Disturbing not only in the extreme experiences it invokes, but also in the way that it forces us to try to understand the motives of both the woman and of the members of the tribe with which she's imprisoned. And thirdly, of course, it forces us to try to understand or to comprehend Lawrence's own intention in writing it. Well, when I first taught Lawrence at university level, back in 1998, not all that long ago, of course, in the big scheme of things, but I was finishing my PhD off at the time, I remember one student telling me how much she struggled with Lawrence. There seems, she said, to be a key to understanding him, but unfortunately I can't discover the key. At the time I was just disappointed that I hadn't provided that key. But actually, looking back, I wish that I'd given her the praise she deserved for responding so honestly and perceptively to the experience of actually reading Lawrence, because I think very often he is a writer who seems to be writing with a particular angle on the material that he's presenting. There does seem to be a certain way of reading him which would make everything clear. The key to The Woman Who Rode Away might initially seem to reside in its fable or perhaps parable structure. The woman, never named in the course of the story, is really a universal type who seems to represent a number of the features of Western civilization which Lawrence found most deadening. She expresses, for a start, romantic idealism. She sentimentalizes Native American culture. She has a very firm belief in her beauty, and she's committed to using it to get her own way. She tries to do that with the Indians initially, but they have absolutely nothing to do with it, of course. And they don't respond to that in the way that she expects. And she pays lip service to a religion in which she avowedly no longer believes. That little detail of her placing her daughter in a convent school, I think, is really significant in the big scheme of things, because the minute she comes into contact with the members of the Chilteri tribe, she immediately says that she wants to escape the white man's god and actually embrace theirs. Her husband, Leadmon, of course the clue is in the German meaning of his name there, he also is a type, 20 years older than her. He's a leathery man, the Leadmon, old and dried up, unable to satisfy his wife's nature or even to relate to her as a sentient being, seeing her more as a possession. And he too, of course, embodies another defunct feature of Western civilization, industrialism, with the disused mine buildings which overshadow his home, reminding us of the wreckage of his own particular secular values. As a fable or parable, The woman who rode away then might be said to trace the coming extinction of an exhausted white civilization, a theme on which Lawrence expatiated at length during his time in New Mexico. The woman leaves behind her home and her children in a search for adventure, beneath which is a certain sign of suicidal nihilism. She dies like Christ at the age of 33, but instead of perishing in order that man shall live, she does so at the behest of another culture, which has its own sacrificial uses for her. Well, the early reception history of this story was very much informed by this understanding of it as a weighty fable. In D.H. Lawrence novelist, for instance, perhaps the most renowned 20th century Lawrence critic, F.R. Leavis, commented that the poetic power of the tale is, in its creative way, an earnestness and profundity of response to the problems of modern civilization. Significantly, I think, Leavis refers to the Lederman Silver Works as a tiny, forlorn outpost of Western civilization with all the essential inner emptiness, he says. He notes how the members of the tribe who lead the woman to their settlement are immune to American feminine charm and despise what she represents. In her new prison, under the influence of the emetic, she must rid herself of the remnants of her dead culture and slowly recognise the truth that, this is Lawrence, her kind of womanhood, intensely personal and individual, was to be obliterated, and the great primeval symbols were to tower once more over the fallen individual independence of woman. Leavis notes how this is presented as an inevitable process, and he praises Lawrence for evoking the strangeness, what he describes as the strangeness of the Indian world, with irresistible actuality, calling it an astonishing feat of imagination. Well, Leavis's book was published in 1955 and was, of course, a landmark in Lawrence criticism, one of the texts which helped to install Lawrence almost single-handedly into the canon and get him taken seriously, certainly at Cambridge, where Leavis taught. In 1970, in the influential second-wave feminist volume, Sexual Politics, Kate Millett, the American critic, educator, artist, and feminist, who sadly died, of course, in September, swept aside such a reading, replacing the obeisance to the text's imaginative stature and its weighty satire on Western civilization with a very candid critique of its gender politics. I like to think of this almost as a kind of a New World response to Leavis in many ways, writing back to him, challenging that notion of Lawrence as the canonical figure. Millett's analysis is refreshingly irreverent, sharp and witty. She declares, critics fudge the meaning of this story by mumbling vaguely that it's all allegorical, symbolic. Of course it is. Symbolic in the same sense as a head exposed on London Bridge. Wonderful line, I think. In Millett's view, the story's apparent critique of Western civilization only serves to obscure its actual purpose as a cautionary tale for the white woman. Lawrence is said to fantasize in this story about the submission of the independent modern woman to the sacred mysteries of ancient man. The negation of the woman's sexuality in the camp that she ends up in, being imprisoned in, does not, for Millett, signal her need to recognise the meaninglessness of her feminine wiles, so much as Lawrence's desire to stage her humiliation and her reduction to a mere object for the use of the tribesman. For Millett, the tale is aggressively pornographic. She says it's astounding in its sadism and malice, the malice with which it's conceived. She calls the impending sacrifice of the woman at the end of the tale a sacrificial rape, and notes that Lawrence's handing of power to the beleaguered Native Americans is duplicitous or fraudulent, presenting its titillating message about male supremacy and female submission as liberal and anti-colonialist. So I mean, that's a view of Lawrence which she expounds on in Sexual Politics, where she thinks Lawrence is almost like a propagandist for a kind of an anti-feminist perspective, where he tries to oppose the independence of woman, but does so in a duplicitous way, with a liberal cover story which hides this kind of propaganda against the woman, almost as if it's getting the women to kind of side with a perspective which Millett thinks is, deeply troubling. Problematic in many respects. Faced by two such opposed views, I think the first thing which we must do is recognise how each casts doubt on the other, exposing its blind spots. Levis's account identifies, of course, and celebrates Lawrence's artistry, but perhaps in its rush to uncover the hidden fable, it risks whitewashing the more disturbing and unresolved aspects of the tale, the thing that stays with you when you've actually finished it and put the book down. Millett's analysis, on the other hand, arguably ignores the artistry in a desire to damn it as vindictive propaganda. And I must say, Millett's account, for all that actually I don't dismiss it as it has been dismissed in the past, I think it's very sharp and witty, and my students often take quite a lot from Millett, and enjoy her critiques of Lawrence. At the same time, they can read other views too and appreciate other views. But her account of Lawrence's creative process does seem to me somewhat paradoxical. She very much presents Lawrence as a sick man, unconsciously reproducing time and again in his work violent fantasies against women to satisfy what she calls perverse needs deep in his own nature. But she also wants us to imagine him as a very conscious producer of anti-feminist propaganda, carefully and calculatingly constructing tales which cover his tracks for any, of course, but the initiated. I think Millett's only concerned with uncovering what she sees as the hidden misogynistic messages in a very select range of Lawrence's fiction: Sons and Lovers, The Plumed Serpent, and The Woman Who Rode Away. She doesn't dwell on the many discursive writings, philosophical essays, other writings and journalistic articles in which Lawrence addresses gender issues in a sensitive and a very enlightened way. I do wish, for instance, that in 1970 she could have accessed a recently discovered piece of writing by Lawrence, produced some 6 months before The Woman Who Rode Away, in which he directly attacks the misogynistic views expressed by a reader of the journal The Adelphi. Allow me to just say a couple of words about this recent discovery. Lawrence, you may know, lived in New Mexico on and off between 1922 and 1925. He returned briefly to Europe in the winter of 1923 to very early 1924. And I must say, returning to Europe from Mexico, hated how dark and miserable it was and how conformist he found the people when he returned there. But during those few months back in Europe, he devoted himself to working on a journal which his friend John Middleton Murray was editing, entitled The Adelphi. Murray had said that he set this journal up to publish some of Lawrence's more outspoken essays. But when Lawrence produced those essays, he was very wary about publishing them because he didn't want to alienate a readership. One of the pieces which was published in the Adelphi, or submitted to the Adelphi and subsequently published, was a piece by a reader that was entitled, unbelievably, The Ugliness of Women. Murray, as editor, published this in April 1924. Lawrence saw that piece when it was at the submission stage. It's a very peculiar piece. It was sent in by a reader as a short reflective piece on his experiences in life, and particularly his experiences of women. What this reader does is to say that at key points in his life, the most beautiful women that he knew, viewed from a certain angle, took on an aspect of evil which no man could, some hideous evil which no man could even contemplate in his worst nightmares. And this reader relates this to the kind of the nature of Eve which women have taken on board. actually says that older women didn't have this look in their eyes because they'd managed to overcome the inherent evil in their own natures. It's only the young who still possess it. And at the end of his piece, he asks whether any of the other clever editors of the Adelphi would have a way of accounting for this experience of horror that he sees when he looks at beautiful women. Lawrence rose to that challenge when he read the piece. He wrote a riposte to that, which addresses it as a piece of utter misogyny. He wrote, "May not the ugliness be lurking in this man's soul? May not his very appreciation of a beautiful woman be in itself a nasty, ugly, unreal thing? If he sees a so-called beautiful woman, up comes a certain nasty lust in him, like when a coyote smells fresh meat and howls hideously outside the campfire." You see how New Mexico got into it, right? If he's also a decent human being, Lawrence writes, there comes upon him at moments a powerful revulsion from his own slightly obscene desires. Then it is that the object of his desires appears to him hideous. The hideousness he sees is the reflection of himself and of the automatic meat lust with which he approaches another individual. And here, at the end of the essay, at the end of this very brief piece, is something that could have been written, I think, in the 1960s, being written in early 1924. Lawrence writes, "Even the most beautiful woman is still a human creature. If he approached her as such, as a being, instead of a piece of lurid meat, he would have no horrors afterwards." That piece, Murray decided not to publish with the article, perhaps because he thought it would libel the person sending the actual original article in. It remained with a whole load of other material in Murray's possession until it was purchased in around about 2012 by the National Library of New Zealand. And it was published for the first time in 2013 in the Times Literary Supplement. So that was just 6 months before Lawrence wrote The Woman Who Rode Away, returned to New Mexico and wrote that story. How I wish Kate Millett could have read that. It doesn't seem to me to be easy to square that version of Lawrence, the one who wants to respond to misogyny and oppose it and stamp it out, with the man who very carefully is a propagandist for misogyny in that way. But of course, the approaches of both Leavis and Millett are shaped by their desire to redress what they saw at the time as imbalances in the public perception of Lawrence. Leavis was attempting to claim Lawrence for serious literature against those who dismissed him as artless, merely sex-obsessed, or, for T.S. Eliot, incapable of what we ordinarily call thought. While Millett was opposing Leavis's account of Lawrence as a serious creative artist, and particularly as a normative moralist, somebody we should take seriously on questions of morality and ethics. Millett's reference at the end of her critique of The Woman Who Rode Away to the anti-colonial, liberal cover story of The Woman Who Rode Away anticipates a later reading of the tale, which attempts, in a further move, to drag it free from the opprobrium of sexual politics by alerting us to its forward-thinking racial politics. In an essay entitled Decolonizing Imagination, Lawrence in the 1920s, and published in 2001, the South African-born late Lawrence scholar, and Mark Kincaid Weeks, shows how Lawrence's short story very finely balances the viewpoints of the white woman and the Native American man, revealing limitations and flaws in both perspectives. The white American woman initially exhibits a patronizing, touristic attitude to the Indians, assuming that it's possible for her to know their way of life and their gods. She's horrified when they refuse to acknowledge her privilege as a white and her sexual attractiveness as a blonde woman. The native men, on the other hand, respond to their displacement, or what they perceive as their displacement in modern society, with hatred and the desire for revenge. The grandson of the chief has spent time in the USA, where he was forced to hide his hair and silenced by his lack of English. His experience in the USA actually mirrors the woman's experience in Mexico, where she too is a fish out of water. Kincaid Weeks shows how Lawrence's tale divides its sympathy between the two, exploring the attitudes of responses of both without endorsing either one. He suggests that the inconclusive ending to the story, with the actual knife hovering over the woman, but you don't actually see what's going to happen, you have to imagine it, that's emblematic of its fine-tuned cultural relativism. It creates, in his own words, a maximum of disturbance and questioning rather than conclusive judgment. Well, in his ABC of reading, Ezra Pound famously defined literature as news that stays news. I think The Woman Who Rode Away qualifies according to that definition. From the 1950s to the 1970s and into the new century, it's retained its freshness for us, speaking to and challenging our views on art, morality, gender politics, and latterly cultural difference. I think one mark of the stature of this story is its ability to accommodate and transcend the different meanings which we discover in it. I think we can safely say that this story of all Lawrence's texts will be the litmus test when future seismic reorientations occur in the discipline of English literary studies. But as the author of a recent biography of Lawrence, I'm also aware that the history of a text's reception doesn't exhaust the range of its possible meanings. So my title, Reading D.H. Lawrence in New Mexico, of course points in two directions. To how we can read D.H. Lawrence today, as we sit here or stand here, of course, in this room in Albuquerque, and to how we might read D.H. Lawrence in the material, historical context of his own time in New Mexico, living and writing in the wonderful, I think at times terrifying isolation of the Kiowa Ranch. However much literary texts transcend the moment of their writing, they were also produced, of course, in a particular place and at a particular time, and they carry indelible traces of their origins. The Woman Who Rode Away was first serialised in Britain in a magazine called The Criterion, edited by T.S. Eliot. It seems incredible to me that Eliot, who had a very embattled relationship to D.H. Lawrence, didn't share Lawrence's religious views in any way at all, or indeed his ethics, should have published of all stories The Woman Who Rode Away. But I'm reminded of Eliot's offhand comments to his brother about the wasteland, which were apparently intended to counter the high seriousness of approaches to his poem as about the wreckage of the post-war world, rather like the kinds of approach that have been taken, of course, to The Woman Who Rode Away. Eliot said, "Various critics have done me the honour to interpret the poem in terms of criticism of the contemporary world, have considered it indeed an important bit of social criticism. To me, it was only the relief of a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life. It's just a piece of rhythmical grumbling." So in the remainder of this lecture, I want to read Lawrence in New Mexico, actually in the Kiowa Ranch, showing how The Woman Who Rode Away was shaped by the conditions of its production. In early May 1924, after a spell of cold weather had broken, I realised it can actually get cold here, can't it? I was out walking this morning about 7 o'clock, my t-shirt on, kind of soaking up every last ray of sun that I can get before I go back to the gloom and the miserable dampness of England. And I didn't realise it was a little chilly, actually. But it lasted until May, the coldness, in 1924. And after that cold weather had broken, Lawrence and Frida went to work on the Kiowa Ranch, which Mabel Dodge Lujan had recently given to Frida. They took with them a Native American carpenter and several helpers to make the place habitable. I should say Lawrence was always very handy working with things, although the people he worked with didn't always appreciate the help that he gave them, or that he thought he was giving them. The plan was for the Lawrences to live in the largest three-room cabin, for their travelling companion, the painter Dorothy Brett, to have the small shed, and it is no more than a shed, and for Mabel and her husband Tony Lujan to have the two-room cabin whenever they wished to visit. However, relations with Mabel, which were never, of course, entirely free of strain, soon took a turn for the worse. On the weekend of the 24th to the 25th of May, Mabel came to visit the ranch with Tony and their friend Clarence Thompson. Tony was furious when he realised that the Lawrences' ownership of the land meant that he would no longer be able to keep his horses there or go camping on it with his friends. So he went off in a rage to go hunting, returning with a freshly shot porcupine. Lawrence objected to Tony hunting in close proximity to his house. The upshot was that Tony stormed off with some of Lawrence's helpers, camping nearby and leaving Mabel alone in the cabin. Next morning, Mabel went to see Lawrence and dissolved into tears. In her own words from her memoir, Lorenzo in Taos, she wept and sobbed and cried, quote, "The tears flowed like rainwater and I shook the solid bedstead. Lawrence sat by my side on the tumbled sheets, bent over, his hands clasped between his parted knees." At the end of June, when the Lawrences made a weekend return visit to Mabel, Frida got drunk and went off with Thompson, telling him that Lawrence was determined to destroy Mabel and felt that he was slowly achieving it each time they met. Mabel's account of this in Lorenzo in Taos is absolutely wonderful. She couldn't stay in bed, so had to get up and go and rap on the door of Clarence Thompson on her small kind of ranch in New Mexico. Mabel found out about Frida's words to Thompson when she went to see him in the night time. He dramatically declared, "Frida has told me the truth. She's told me many things, many. But what concerns us is what he's doing to you. She says he's told her he will destroy you, and every time he comes down here, he goes a little further with it, and every time you're a little weaker and more sick after he's left. She says she's scared." He told Mabel, "You don't know that man's power." Well, Frida later dismissed her claim that Lawrence was set on destroying Mabel, calling it unreal and unwholesome bunk. But there are very good reasons to assume that what she said was right, and that she was actually reporting Lawrence's very words. Alcohol, actually, I think very often brings out the truth, not always the opposite. Back in January 1918, Lawrence had told his friend Lady Cynthia Asquith, "I think I might be, in some sort, a psychic physician. Not doing anything direct, but merely as a presence." This comment was made in the context of an offer to look after the Asquith's autistic son, John. He thought, particularly if John spent time around himself and Frida, that they could set his psychic balance right in some way and address the son's experience. It seems plausible to me that Lawrence seriously believed in his power to exert a negative psychic influence on his enemies. The Woman Who Rode Away, which was written between the May and June visits, certainly helped Lawrence to exercise some of his anger at Mabel, and it may have formed part of his imagined psychic attack on her. Although the woman is a representative figure whose life and circumstances do not exactly match those of Mabel, the atmosphere of the story, its portrayal of the woman as sentimentalising the Indians, and its feeling that deathly submission to them is the only answer to her willfulness, relate, I think, in compelling ways to Lawrence's understanding of his Taos hostess. As Mabel herself noted in Lorenzo in Taos, he, that is to say Lawrence, held me to be the prototype of that greatest living abomination, the dominating American woman. To imagine Mabel's submission and destruction provided Lawrence with vicarious satisfaction, channeling the desire he sometimes felt to cause her actual harm or to bring about her downfall. The tension between the Lawrences and Mabletown, as her settlement was called, went on for some weeks afterwards. And when Mabel suffered a form of breakdown in October of that same year, 1924, she ascribed it to Lawrence's influence on her, to what she calls the strange power of his presence, though I'm sure there were certainly more mundane ways of accounting for it. Prohibition-era moonshine made a key contribution to this surprising episode in Lawrence's life at the Kiowa Ranch. But the adjustment to living at altitude also doubtless intensified conflicts and led to an altered perception of things. Lawrence actually wrote an unfinished comical play entitled Altitude shortly before he left Mabletown to live at the Kiowa Ranch. The play's list of personae includes Mabel, but also the people Lawrence lived with on her settlement, including her husband Tony and Clarence Thompson. And the manic dialogue captures the slightly unreal, sometimes excessively civilised, but often actually conflictual reality of living under their host's care. If the description of the Indians' treatment of the woman, of their barely concealed hatred of all she represents, and of her submission and impending sacrifice was shaped in part by Lawrence's immediate feelings towards Mabel, then his experience of moving to the ranch and adjusting to the altitude and isolation must also have informed the woman's marvellous drug-induced responsiveness to the Indian ceremonial dancing and the drumbeat as she intently watches from the topmost roof of her prison. As is so often the case with Lawrence, his sympathetic art belies any kind of personal antipathy he may have felt. In The Woman Who Rode Away, while his mood may have caused him to identify with the Indians, his situation enabled him to understand the woman's emotions too. Like the sounds of night at the Kiowa Ranch, the woman hears something of the chuckling, sobbing cry of the coyote, something of the exultant bark of the fox, the far-off, wild, melancholy exultance of the howling wolf, the torment of the puma's scream. For her, it's both life-changing and awful. In the novella St. Maur, another of the fictions Lawrence worked on in the summer of 1924, there's a description of still, glittering nights at the ranch, when great stars sitting on the mountain's edge seem to be watching like the eyes of a mountain lion. Then the coyotes in the near canyon howled and sobbed and ran like shadows over the snow. Lawrence's feat of imagination in The Woman Who Rode Away was conditioned, I think, by the quotidian, material context of its writing. If we really attend closely to the story, we can see and hear and feel New Mexico and the Kiowa Ranch through this tale of Mexican Indians. The transmutation of experience contributes, I think, in an important way to the enriching plenitude that great art embodies. Well, how very lucky we are that the Kiowa Ranch is still there, cared for and preserved by the university, and that we remain able, in both senses of the term, to read D.H. Lawrence in New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful, wonderful, balanced, astute, just fascinating lecture. I just want to invite all of you to join us out in the lobby. We have some cookies and we have some iced tea, and we also have a wonderful display of books that UNM Bookstore has been kind enough to come here and bring Lawrence's books and some of Dr. Harrison's books, and we'd love to have you come out and talk Lawrence or whatever you want to talk about. Just stick around for a few minutes. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and thank you for coming all the way from Nottingham.
I should say actually that on Saturday I have the good fortune to be going to Taos, to the Harwood Museum, and actually giving a reading from the biography. And some of that reading will deal with Lawrence's very earliest years in Eastwood and Nottingham, But I will also be talking about some new research that I did into Lawrence's time in New Mexico, including actually work that I did getting in touch with the family of one of the two Danish artists whom Lawrence wintered with at the Del Monte Ranch, the first of the two ranches he lived in New Mexico. In the winter of 1922 to 23, contacted the family and actually found some new material, including a wonderful photograph of Lawrence attempting to operate a two-man saw and chop up firewood at the ranch, doing a very, very bad job. These two strapping Danes to help him with that work. So, I mean, I look very much forward to doing that. And of course, to seeing the ranch, only the second time that I'll have been up at the ranch. A serious, I think, experience of a place that was so dear to Lawrence, which he never really wanted ever to give up, and which he held on to against failing health until he was absolutely unable to go and live out there, and was made aware of that, one of the great tragedies of his life. So any of you who can come along to the Harvard Museum on Saturday, it would be absolutely fantastic to see you there. Thank you so much for your kindness in coming along today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, good work.
Thank you.